My name is Daniel Reyes, and the first time they put the blue pill in my hand, I told myself I was only going to take it once. I have been telling myself things ever since. I was 41 years old when the Sclerites took the colony. I had been a signals analyst for the Outer Reach Survey Corps, 3rd grade, the kind of job you give a man when his hands have started shaking and his commanding officer doesn't want to write the letter to his wife. I had a wife once. I had a daughter. I am going to tell you what happened to me on the station they called the Hive's mouth, and I am going to try to tell it straight, because there are not many of us left who can, and the ones who can owe it to the ones who cannot. The colony was called St. Mira. 7,000 souls on a dust-colored rock that orbited a yellow star nobody back home could find on a map. We grew lichen protein in pressure tents, and we mined trace metals out of the regolith, and on Sundays the old priest from Ceres rang a bell that had been welded together out of 2 cargo plates, and the children would run across the main concourse in their socks, because their parents could not afford boots that fit them every season. I am telling you about the bell because you will not understand what came after if you do not first understand the bell. We were poor. We were a long way from anywhere. We were not a colony anyone would have come to rescue. The Sclerites came at dawn, station local. I remember because I was on the night shift in the listening post, and I had just poured my 3rd coffee. The cup was a souvenir my daughter had painted at the colony school, a lopsided rocket on a field of yellow. I still see that cup sometimes in the dark behind my eyelids, sitting full on the console while the alarm started. They did not announce themselves. They did not transmit demands. They simply arrived in a shape the sensors could not agree on, 3 vessels that looked like fused beetles the size of office buildings, and they sang. That is the only word for it. They sang into our communications array on a frequency that was not meant for human ears, and every speaker in the listening post began to vibrate, and the men on shift with me began to weep without knowing they were weeping. I watched Sergeant Coyle put his pistol under his jaw and pull the trigger before any of us could move. I watched Lieutenant Auber walk out the airlock without a suit. I watched the coffee in my cup ripple in time with the song, and I do not know why I did not weep, and I do not know why I did not walk out the airlock, and I have spent 22 months trying to forgive myself for being the one who lived. What I did was crawl under the console. I clamped my hands over my ears and I bit down on the leather of my collar and I waited. The song went on for 40 minutes by the chronometer. When it stopped, the only sound in the listening post was the soft hum of the ventilation and the wet ticking of Coyle's blood drying on the panel above me. I crawled out. I looked at the screens. St. Mira was burning in 3 places: the main concourse where the bell had been, the school, the pressure tents on the South Ridge where the lichen farmers slept. I tried to raise my wife on the household band. Nothing answered. I tried my daughter's school tag. Nothing answered. I sat in Sergeant Coyle's blood for some unknown length of time, and then I got up because there was nothing else to do, and I walked outside to surrender. They were already waiting. I had heard rumors about the Sclerites. Everyone had. Frontier gossip mostly, scraps from freighters that had crossed paths with their long-range scouts and limped home with crews short 3 or 4 bodies. They were said to be a hive species. They were said to be older than our entire civilization. They were said to be incapable of lying, and that last part I had always dismissed as romantic nonsense, because everything that lives lies. It is how you stay alive. A rabbit that cannot fake a limp gets eaten by the fox. A man who cannot keep a straight face does not last long in a card game or a marriage. I assumed it was a translation error. It was not a translation error. The thing that came down the ramp toward me stood 7 feet at the thorax. Its carapace was the color of wet slate, slick with something that smelled like ozone and crushed almonds. It had 4 arms, 2 for walking when it bent forward and 2 for everything else, and its head was a smooth, tapered wedge with no eyes I could find. It spoke to me through a translator collar at its throat, and its voice was flat and patient and unbearably calm. "You are useful," it said. "Come." That was the entire conversation. No threats, No demands, no promises. It did not tell me my family was alive because they were not and it could not. It did not tell me I would be returned home because I would not and it could not. It told me I was useful, and that was the truth, and the truth was the only weapon it ever drew on me. I followed it onto the ship because I was useful, and I have been thinking about that word every day since. They put 1,100 of us on the transport. That was all that was left of St. Mira. I looked for my wife in the crush of bodies in the hold. I looked for my daughter. I found neither. I found an old man I had played dominoes with on the freight dock, and he held my hand without speaking, and we rode up to the station together with our foreheads pressed against the cold metal of the hull. The station was the size of a small moon. They called it, in their flat, patient way, the Hive's mouth, and when the transport came around the curve of it and I saw the scale of the thing, my mind simply refused for several seconds to process what my eyes were sending it. It was not built. It was grown. The hull was ribbed and segmented like the body of some enormous insect, and there were openings in it the size of orbital docks, and inside those openings I could see softer light, amber and slow, the color of honey held up to a candle. The Sclerites did not build stations. They secreted them. We were taken in through one of the smaller mouths. We were sorted. The sorting was done by a Sclerite who put one of its smaller hands on each of our skulls in turn, held it there for perhaps 3 seconds, and spoke a single word to the handlers behind it. Most of the words I did not understand. Some I came to learn. The old man who had held my hand on the transport was given a word that meant, roughly, protein. He was led away down a corridor that sloped downward, and I never saw him again, and I have made my peace with what I think happened to him, and I will not write it here. When the Sclerite put its hand on my skull, it paused. It held its hand there for longer than the others. Then it spoke a word I did not know, and the handler beside it made a small clicking sound with its mouth parts that I would later learn was the closest thing they had to surprise. I was led down a corridor that sloped upward. The room they put me in was not a cell. That is the first thing you have to understand. It was a study. There was a desk of some dark resinous material, and a chair sized roughly for a human, and a sleeping pallet against the far wall with a clean gray blanket folded at the foot. There was a basin of water. There was a small alcove with a slot where, 3 times a day, a tray of food would appear. The food was bland and gray and entirely sufficient. There was a window, or what I thought was a window, a long oval of softer amber light that looked out onto the slow curve of the station's interior, the great honeycombed dark with its drifting motes of luminous dust. And there was a console. The console was the only thing in the room that had clearly been made for human hands. It had a keyboard with our letters on it. It had a screen. It had a single dish, set into the desk beside it, lined with a soft cloth, and on the cloth, when I first walked into the room, sat a single blue pill. The Sclerite who brought me in did not explain. It pointed to the chair. It pointed to the console. It pointed to the pill. Then it pointed to the screen, and the screen lit up, and on it, in plain block English, was a single line of text. Right. That was all. The Sclerite left. The door, which was not a door but a kind of soft contraction of the wall itself, closed behind it. I sat down at the desk because my legs were no longer reliable. I looked at the pill. I looked at the screen. I looked at the pill again. I did not take it that first day. I sat at the desk for what the chronometer in the corner of the screen told me was 9 hours, and I did not touch the pill, and I did not touch the keyboard. I thought about my wife. I thought about my daughter. I thought about the bell on the concourse and the coffee cup with the lopsided rocket. I thought about whether a man who has lost everything still has the right to refuse anything, and I could not find an answer. On the second day, a different Sclerite came in. This one was smaller, the color of dry bone, and its translator collar was older and crackled when it spoke. It looked at the untouched pill. It looked at the blank screen. It looked at me. "You are useful," it said. "Begin." "What am I supposed to write?" I said, My voice was hoarse. I had not used it in 2 days. I had not thought I would use it again. The Sclerite tilted its wedge of a head. The gesture, I would later learn, was the closest thing they had to a frown. "You are a teller of patterns," it said. "We have brought you here because you tell patterns. The pill assists. Begin." "What patterns?" "The patterns of your species. The patterns of how your species moves. The patterns of how your species defends itself. The patterns of how your species fails." I looked at the pill again. I understood then in a cold, quiet way that did not feel like fear because I was already past fear, what they wanted. They had not chosen me at random. They had read my mind on the dock, and they had found, in the back of it, the truth that I had spent 20 years burying under coffee and shift work and quiet rooms in the back of listening posts. I had been a writer once. Before the Corps, before the marriage, before the daughter and the colony. I had written 1 bad novel and 3 good stories, and I had quit because the world did not pay me for them, and I had told no one, and I had taken the pension job on the frontier because the frontier was a place. A man went to stop being whatever he used to be. They had found it anyway. They had reached into my head with their patient 3-fingered hand, and they had found the writer, and they had decided he was useful. "What is the pill?" I said. "An assistant," said the Sclerite. "It loosens, it quickens, it will make the work easier. You will take it, you will write, you will be fed, you will be kept. This is the arrangement." "And if I don't?" The Sclerite tilted its head the other way. The gesture, I would later learn, was the closest thing they had to confusion. "Then you will not be useful," it said, and it left. I sat with the pill for another 6 hours, then I took it. I will not lie to you about what happened next, because lying about it would betray the only thing I have left. The pill was good. The pill was very good. It dissolved on my tongue with a faint taste of copper and something floral, and within 10 minutes the inside of my skull went still in a way it had not been still since I was a young man. The grief did not go away. The grief was still there, sitting in my chest like a stone in a coat pocket. But the noise around the grief, the static of it, the endless scratching loop of did I do enough and could I have run faster and was she awake at the end, that noise went quiet. And in the quiet the words came. They came in clean, orderly rows. They came in paragraphs that built without effort. I wrote for 9 hours straight that first night, and when I finally stopped, my hands were not shaking, and I was not tired, and the screen in front of me was full of the most fluid prose I had produced in my entire life. I had written a detailed account of the orbital approach patterns of the Outer Reach Survey Corps, the standard rotations, the blind spots, the way the listening posts rotated their watches, and the way the rotations slipped on holidays. I had written it as a story. I had written it as a story because the Sclerites had asked for patterns, and I knew, in some part of me, that the pill had not entirely quieted, that the cleanest way to hand a pattern to someone who does not lie is to hand it to them as a story. A story, after all, is a lie that admits it is a lie. The Sclerite came back in the morning. It read what I had written. It read it slowly, its head bent close to the screen, the segmented muscles around its mouth parts working in a way I would come to recognize as concentration. When it finished, it turned to me, and it spoke a single word. "Useful." It left. A new pill appeared on the cloth dish. This was how I lived for a long time. I do not know precisely how long. The chronometer on the screen reset every cycle, and the cycles were not Earth days, and I lost count somewhere in what I think was the 3rd month. I wrote every day. I took the pill every day. I ate the gray food, and I slept on the pallet, and I watched the slow, honey-colored dark drift past my window. I wrote them everything they asked for. I wrote them the standard patrol routes of the Outer Reach. I wrote them the response protocols for an attack on a frontier colony. I wrote them the locations of the major orbital staging yards and the rotations of the dreadnought squadrons and the names and habits of the senior officers I had served under. I wrote them all of it, in clean, orderly prose, and they took it from the screen each morning, and each morning a new pill appeared. The Sclerite who came to collect the documents most often was the small one with the dry-bone carapace and the crackling collar. I came to think of him, in my own head, as the reader. He had a habit of standing very still while he read, his wedge of a face inches from the screen, and I learned to tell from the slight working of the muscles around his mouthparts when he was pleased and when he was puzzled. He was never angry. None of them were ever angry. Anger was another thing they did not seem to have a use for. If a document fell short of what they had asked for, the reader would simply tap the screen with one of his smaller fingers and say, "Insufficient. Continue." And I would continue, and the pill would assist. There were other Sclerites who passed through. On a rotation I never managed to figure out. There was a tall one whose carapace had a long pale scar across one of the thoracic plates, and I came to think of him as the soldier, because his hands were larger and harder than the reader's, and there was something about the way he stood that suggested he had at some point in his life been used for things other than reading. There was a slow one I called the old one, whose carapace had faded to the color of wet cardboard, and whose translator collar mispronounced certain English consonants in a way that, after a while, I found almost endearing. The old one was the only Sclerite who ever, in my entire time on the station, said anything to me that was not strictly task-related. Once, after reading a document I had written about the morale traditions of frontier units, he stood for a long moment at the foot of my desk and then said, in his slightly off pronunciation, "Your species sings before battle. Why?" I thought about it. The pill was in my blood and the thinking was easy. "Because we're afraid," I said. The old one tilted his head. "We do not understand fear of that variety. Explain." "We're afraid we won't come back, so we sing while we still can." The old one stood there for what felt like a long time. Then he made a soft clicking sound in his throat and the translator did not translate it and he left. He did not say useful. He did not say anything. I did not see him again for 3 cycles. When he came back, he did not refer to the conversation. But the next document they asked me for was about morale, and I understood, in some part of me, that the pill had not entirely quieted, that the old one had been thinking about what I said. That was, I think now, the first crack. I did not know it at the time. At the time it was just a small, odd moment with a faded old Sclerite who had asked me a question, but it stayed with me. It sat in the back of my skull and it would not go away, and the pill did not dissolve it the way it dissolved everything else. The old one had asked a question. The old one had wanted to know. Curiosity, I thought, was the one human emotion they had kept, the one piece of furniture they had carried with them out of whatever long evolutionary house they had come from. They were curious about us. They were taking us apart with their patient 3-fingered hands because they wanted to know what made us tick. And a thing that wants to know can be told things. I did not act on the thought for a long time. I was not brave. I was not, at that point, even angry in any way that would have been useful. I was a man with a pill in a quiet room, and the pill was good, and the room was warm, and the screaming under my ribs was something I had learned to keep at a distance most days, and I told myself that the documents I was producing were patterns the Sclerites already understood in some broader sense, and that the specifics did not matter. The outer reach was 1,000 light-years away. The Sclerites were already winning. My wife was already dead. My daughter was already dead. The patterns I was handing them were patterns they would have worked out on their own in a year or 2. And what was the difference between a year and now to a species that built stations by secreting them? I want you to understand something, because if you do not understand it, the rest of this will not make sense. I was not resisting. Not at first. Not for a long time. I was a broken man on a station the size of a moon, and I had been given a quiet room and clean water and a pill that made the screaming inside my skull stop, and I told myself, in the small hours when the pill was wearing off and the screaming started to come back, that none of what I was writing actually mattered. The outer reach was 1,000 light-years away. The Sclerites were already winning. My wife was already dead. My daughter was already dead. The patterns I was handing them were patterns they would have worked out on their own in a year or two, and what was the difference between a year and now to a species that built stations by secreting them? That is the lie I told myself. That is the first lie. I am telling it to you now so you will know I am not pretending I was a hero. I was not a hero. I was a man with a pill in a quiet room, and I was useful. The thing that changed me happened in what I think was the 5th month. A new Sclerite came to my room. This one was larger than the others, and its carapace was so dark it was almost black, and the smaller Sclerites who attended it walked half a pace behind it with their heads lowered. It did not sit. It did not introduce itself. It stood at the foot of my desk, and it looked at me with its eyeless wedge of a face, and it spoke. "We require a different pattern," it said. "All right. We require the pattern by which your species would attempt to retake this station." I did not say anything for a moment. I had been sitting at the desk. I had been about to take the morning's pill. It was still on the dish, small and blue and waiting. "You have not been attacked," I said. "We will be," said the Sclerite. "Eventually, it is a pattern. We wish to understand the pattern in advance. You will write it." I don't know how the Corps would retake a station like this. I'm a signals analyst. I'm not a tactician. You are a teller of patterns. You will tell this pattern the pill assists. The Sclerite did not move. The smaller Sclerites behind it did not move. I looked at the pill on the dish. I looked at the screen. I thought, for the first time in 5 months, about what I was about to do. A species that does not lie cannot imagine being lied to. That is the thing about them I had been turning over in my hands without realizing it. They had not asked me, ever, whether what I was writing was true. They had simply assumed it was. They had read the patterns off my pages the way you read the rings off a fallen tree, because in their world a pattern told is a pattern that exists, and a story is just a slower kind of report. They had no defense against fiction because fiction was, to them, a thing that had never evolved. A rabbit that cannot fake a limp gets eaten by the fox. The Sclerites had never needed to fake a limp. The Sclerites were the fox. But somewhere, very far down, I had not always been a signals analyst. I had been a writer. And a writer is, in the end, a person who has spent his life learning to lie convincingly to creatures who know better. "I will need 3 days, I said. "You will have them." The Sclerite left. The smaller ones followed. The door contracted shut. I sat at the desk for a long time. I looked at the pill. I did not take it. I picked it up between my thumb and forefinger, and I turned it in the amber light from the window, and I looked at it, and I thought about my wife, and I thought about my daughter, and I thought about the bell on the concourse. And for the first time since I had walked down that ramp to surrender, I felt something move in my chest that was not grief and was not fear. It was the small, mean thing a man keeps in the back of his ribs for the day he finds out the people who took everything from him are also, in some small specific way, stupid. I put the pill back on the dish. I did not take it that day. I wrote without it. The writing was harder. The words did not come in clean rows. They came in fits and stutters, and my hands shook, and the screaming started up again under my breastbone and would not stop. And twice I had to get up and put my forehead against the cold amber of the window until I could breathe. But I wrote. And what I wrote this time was a lie. I wrote them a plan for retaking the Hive's mouth. I wrote it in the same clean, orderly prose I had been writing for 5 months. I wrote it as if it were the standard doctrine of the Outer Reach Survey Corps, which it was not, because there was no doctrine for assaulting a station the size of a moon that no human had ever seen. I invented it. I built it from the ground up, scene by scene, the way I had once built bad novels in a cheap apartment on series before I gave up. I wrote that the Corps would approach from the system's third gravity well, because the system did not have a useful third gravity well, and the approach would put any real attacking force in a kill box. I wrote that the Corps would commit its dreadnoughts to a frontal feint on the largest of the station's mouths, because committing dreadnoughts to a frontal anything was the surest way to lose them. I wrote that the assault would come during the station's quietest local cycle, when in fact a competent commander would have come during the loudest. I wrote, in short, a confession so plausible and so detailed, and so wrong that any defense built on it would leave the station soft in exactly the places it needed to be hard. I wrote it without the pill. I wrote it with the screaming under my ribs and my hands shaking on the keys, and when I was done, 3 cycles later, I was 20 pounds lighter and I had not slept, and the inside of my skull felt like a room someone had been kicking. But the document was clean. The prose was as good as anything I had given them before. Better, because this time I cared. I took the pill on the morning of the 4th day. I took it because the larger Sclerite was due, and I knew that if I came to the meeting hollow-eyed and shaking it would notice, and the pill would do what the pill was good at, which was make a man look calm. The larger Sclerite came. It read the document. It read it twice. Its segmented mouthparts worked in the slow, careful way I had come to recognize, and when it was done it turned to me and it said, "Useful." It left. I sat at the desk and I waited until the door was sealed, and the lock had clicked, and the small thrum of the station's life had taken up its usual place at the bottom of my hearing. Then I put my head down on the resinous desk, and I cried in a way I had not cried since the morning of the song, because for the first time since they had pulled me off the transport, I had done something my wife would have been proud of, and she was not there to see it, and she was never going to be there to see it, and that somehow was worse than anything they had done to me. I want to tell you that I stopped taking the pill after that. I did not. The pill kept the screaming quiet, and I had work to do, and the work required a steady hand. What I did instead was begin to lie inside the pill. Every document they gave me from that day forward I poisoned. Not so much that they would notice, just enough. A wrong rotation here, an invented kill box there, a false name for a real officer, a false habit for a real squadron. I built a fictional outer reach survey core over the top of the real one, the way a forger builds a fake painting over a real canvas, and I handed it to them page by page, and they took it and they said, each time, "Useful," and each time I felt the small mean thing under my ribs grow a little less small. It was not a single act. It was a craft. I worked at it the way I had once worked at the bad novel, and the way I had once worked at the 3 good stories, and I will tell you, because I do not know how else to say it, that there was a small part of me in those long cycles that came back to life. I had been a writer once. A writer is a man who arranges true things and false things into a shape that is neither entirely true nor entirely false, and the shape is the thing that does the work, and I had not done that work in 20 years, and I had forgotten how good it could feel to do it well. The pill assisted. The pill quickened. But the pill was not what was lying. The pill was just a tool. The lying was mine. I learned in those cycles what the Sclerites would and would not accept. They would accept any pattern that resembled in its overall shape the patterns they already had. A document that said the outer reach used a 3-watch rotation could safely lie about the timings of the watches, because the 3-watch rotation itself was a known thing. A document that said the core had only 2-watch rotations would have been suspect. So I lied at the level of the details and told the truth at the level of the architecture, and the architecture was the part they noticed, and the details were the part that mattered. I learned that they had a particular weakness for completeness. A document that left a gap, an unfinished section, an unanswered question, would be returned to me for further work. A document that closed every loop, that answered every question, that gave them the satisfying click of a finished puzzle, would be accepted without rereading. So I closed every loop. I answered every question. I gave them satisfying completeness, and inside the completeness I planted whatever I wanted, and they swallowed it whole, the way a man who has been told a good story stops looking at the corners of the room. I learned that the reader read everything word for word, but the soldier skimmed for the operational sections, and the old one only ever read the parts about people. I learned to put my safest lies in the parts the soldier would read, because he was the one whose word would carry weight if the document went to whatever council of Sclerites decided what to do with my work. And I learned to put my truest writing in the parts the old one would read, because the old one was the only one of them who, I had begun to suspect, would have noticed if I had given him nothing real to chew on. I wrote the old one a long passage once about why human soldiers carry photographs of their families into combat, and I did not lie in it at all, and I do not know what he did with it, but he came back to my room the next cycle without a document request, and he stood at the foot of my desk, and after a while he said, "You carry no photograph." "They didn't let me bring anything," I said. What would the photograph have been of? I thought about the lopsided rocket on the side of the coffee cup. "My daughter," I said. The old one stood there for a long moment. Then he said, "Continue your work," and he left. I tell you about that conversation because if you are imagining the Sclerites as monsters, I want you to know that I am not sure they were. They were a species. They were a species that had taken my colony and killed my wife and my daughter and put me in a quiet room with a pill, and I would have killed any one of them with my bare hands if I had thought I could get away with it. But the old one had asked me about the photograph. The old one had wanted to know. And the part of me that hated them most was not, I will admit, the part of me that wrote the lies. The part of me that wrote the lies was something colder and older than hatred, and I am still not entirely sure what to call it. I do not know how long this went on. Months. I think a year. The chronometer reset and reset. The gray food came 3 times a cycle and I ate it, and the pill came once a cycle and I took it and I wrote, and the Sclerites read what I wrote, and somewhere out there in the dark beyond the amber window, my poison was sinking into the deep cold of their planning, and I did not know if it would ever matter, and I told myself every night that it did not have to matter. The lying itself was the point. The lying was the thing they could not do. The lying was the one corner of my skull they had not been able to reach into and pull out, and as long as I had it I was still, in some way I could just barely defend a man. There were bad cycles. I want to be honest about that too. There were cycles when the pill wore off in the middle of a document, and the screaming came up under my ribs so hard I could not stay in the chair, and I would walk the 4 paces from the desk to the window and back again. The 4 paces from the desk to the window and back again, for what felt like hours, until the chronometer told me it had been 20 minutes and I was no further along in the document, and the reader would be in soon. There were cycles when I could not remember my daughter's face. That was the worst. Not that she was dead, because I had already made my peace with that as far as a man can make peace with a thing like that, but that the pill was eating the parts of me that remembered her, and I would sit at the desk and try to call up the lopsided rocket on the side of the coffee cup, and find that I could only call up the shape of it, the general idea of a cup, the general idea of a rocket, and the specific yellow of the field around the rocket would be gone. And I would put my forehead on the desk and I would say her name out loud, over and over, until it came back to me. Some cycles it did not come back. Those were the cycles I poisoned the documents the hardest. Then the dreadnoughts came. I knew before the alarm started. I knew because the larger Sclerite came into my room without knocking, which it had never done, and it stood at the foot of my desk and it said one word, and the word was, "Now." I stood up. I did not take the pill. I had not taken the pill in 3 days. I had been waiting, in some part of me that had not yet admitted what it was waiting for exactly this moment, and I wanted to meet it with my own face. "Now what?" I said. "Your species is here," said the Sclerite. "They have come, the pattern you described, the 3rd gravity well, the dreadnought faint, the quiet cycle, they are here." I looked at it. It looked at me. Through the wall behind it I could hear, very faintly, the first low note of something that was not the station's hum. It was the song. It was the same song that had killed Sergeant Coyle and walked Lieutenant Auber out the airlock, and somewhere on the other side of the station's hull, a Sclerite vessel was beginning to sing into our communications array, and somewhere in the dark, the dreadnoughts of the Outer Reach Survey Corps were coming in. They were not coming from the third gravity well. They had come from the second. I knew because the second was where they would have come from if they had been led there by a man writing patterns from the inside of a station the size of a moon. The third would have killed them. The second was where the kill box was not. I had spent a year teaching the Sclerites to look at the wrong door. I did not say any of this to the Sclerite. I am not a fool, I said, then I have been useful. You have been useful, said the Sclerite. And it stood there in the amber light, and I will tell you something I have never told anyone because I do not entirely understand it myself. The Sclerite in that moment looked at me the way a man looks at a tool he has just realized has a face. Not with anger, not with suspicion, with a slow, patient confusion that I think, in its own species, was the closest thing it had to the question how. It did not ask the question. It could not have, I think. Its language did not have the shape for it. It simply turned and walked out of my room, and the door contracted shut behind it, and I sat down at my desk for what I knew was the last time, and I took the last pill because I wanted for once to be calm. The station shook. The amber light in the window flickered. Somewhere very far down through the levels of the hive's mouth, something enormous gave way, and I felt it through the soles of my feet the way you feel a tree fall a long way off in a forest. The core had hit the underside. They had hit it where I had told the Sclerites it would never be hit, and they had hit it hard. I will not pretend I saw the battle. I did not. I sat in my room and I listened to the station die around me. The shaking went on for a long time. The amber light in the window went dark and came back orange and went dark again. The gray food did not come. The door did not open. At one point I heard, from somewhere down the corridor, the chittering panic of Sclerites in a tongue that no translator collar was carrying, and the sound was so unlike anything they had let me hear before that I understood, then, what it was. It was the sound of a species that did not know how to be lied to discovering that it had been. I heard twice the muffled crack of explosive breaching charges going off somewhere far above me. I felt, once, a long slow shudder through the floor that I think now was a Sclerite vessel coming apart against the inside of the hull. I smelled, at some point, smoke that did not smell like any smoke I had ever known, sweet and acrid, and faintly like the ozone almond smell of the Sclerites themselves, and I understood that something inside the walls was burning. The amber window went dark for the last time and stayed dark, and I sat in the dimness of the room with only the dull red glow of the emergency lighting in the corridor showing under the door. And I waited because there was nothing else to do. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that. I felt the small mean thing under my ribs go very still, and I felt in its place an exhaustion so complete that I lay down on the pallet and I closed my eyes and I waited for whatever was going to happen next. I thought in some confused, tired way that the next thing was probably going to be a Sclerite coming through the wall to kill me, and I found that I did not particularly mind. I had written the wrong door. The wrong door had been walked through. The rest was a question of what came through the door of my own room, and I had made my peace with most of the possibilities. What happened next was a hand on my shoulder. It was a human hand. It was wearing the gauntlet of an outer-reach boarding suit, and the gauntlet was scorched along the knuckles, and the woman inside the suit had her visor up, and she was looking down at me with the kind of expression a soldier wears when she has been told there might be survivors, and she has not, until this moment, believed it. "Sir," she said, "sir, can you walk?" I opened my mouth. I tried to say my name. What came out was, I wrote them the wrong door. She looked at me for a long second. Then she said very gently, "I know, sir. We followed you in." I do not remember much about the evacuation. I remember the cold of the boarding tube. I remember a medic with red hair putting a heated blanket around me and asking me, 3 separate times, if I had eaten anything in the last day, and each time I forgot the answer before she finished the question. I remember being carried down a corridor that smelled, blessedly, of human sweat and gun oil, and the slightly burned plastic of recycled air. I remember, at some point, looking up and seeing, through a viewport, the hive's mouth coming apart in slow, honey-colored chunks against the black, and the dreadnoughts of the outer reach moving among the chunks like quiet, patient sharks, and I remember thinking, very clearly, that this was the first thing I had seen in a year that was not the inside of a room. They debriefed me for 6 weeks, not in a cell, in a clean white room on the medical deck of the dreadnought Calliope, with a window that showed real stars. They had a man from intelligence who came in every morning with a list of questions, and a woman from psychiatry who came in every afternoon with a different list, and a chaplain who came in on Sundays and did not ask any questions at all and just sat with me, and I think the chaplain did me more good than the other 2 combined. I told them everything. I told them about the song that had killed Coyle and Auber. I told them about the sorting on the dock. I told them about the old man who had held my hand on the transport. I told them about the larger Sclerite and its slow, patient confusion, and the way it had said useful, and the way the word had begun, somewhere in the 2nd month, to taste like ash in my mouth. I told them about the pill. I held nothing back about the pill. I told them I had taken it every day for what I thought was at least 8 months, and I told them I did not know what it had done to me, and the woman from psychiatry wrote in her pad and did not look up. The man from intelligence wanted to know, more than anything else, how I had known the Corps would come. I told him I had not known. I had hoped. I had written the lie because the lie was the only thing left to write, and the lie had to be specific enough to draw a real plan in opposition to it. And I had trusted, in some corner of myself, I had not entirely abandoned, that somewhere out there was a tactician with my file on her desk, who would read the Sclerite intercepts and recognize the smell of my prose and understand what I had done. He looked at me for a long time when I said that. Then he said, "Sir, we have been reading your prose for 9 months. The pattern analysts on this ship had a working theory by the 2nd document. By the 5th, they had committed to it. We have been planning this assault on the assumption that everything you wrote was a lie of a very specific shape, and that the shape was telling us where to actually attack." I did not have anything to say to that. I sat with the heated blanket around my shoulders, and I looked at my hands, and I thought about my daughter's lopsided rocket on the side of a coffee cup that no longer existed, and the man from intelligence, to his credit, sat with me in the silence and did not try to fill it. Eventually he said, "Your wife, your daughter." "I know," I said. "We didn't find them, sir. We swept the records. They weren't on the manifest. We don't know what happened. I'm sorry." "I know," I said. He left after a while. The chaplain came in, although it was not Sunday, and sat down in the chair the man from intelligence had used, and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "It was a good lie, Daniel." "Was it?" I said. "It was the kind of lie a man tells when he has nothing left and decides to use the nothing." I did not answer him. I closed my eyes. The pill had been out of my blood for 6 weeks by then, and the screaming under my ribs had come back, and it was loud, and I did not know how to live with it without the pill, and the chaplain, I think, knew that, because he stayed in the chair until I fell asleep, and when I woke up he was gone, but the chair was still pulled close to the bed, and I think about that chair sometimes. That was 2 years ago. The outer reach pinned the Sclerite advance at the Hive's mouth and pushed them back through 3 more systems before the ceaseline held. The war is not over. The Sclerites are still out there, and they are still a Hive species, and they are still older than our entire civilization, and they still cannot lie. But they have learned, the intelligence people tell me, to be suspicious of the patterns humans tell them. They have learned that a species that lies to itself first will lie to anyone, and that the lie can be a weapon, and that the weapon does not look like a weapon until it has already gone off. I do not work for the Corps anymore. I drew a pension and a quiet commendation that the chaplain had to talk me into accepting, and I bought a small place on a salvage moon out past the old St. Mira run, where the gravity is light, and the bell at the local chapel is welded together out of cargo plates, and I sit on a porch in the evening, and I watch the dust come down across the regolith, and I try, very hard, not to think about the blue pill. I do not always succeed. There are nights when the screaming under my ribs is bad, and I wake up in the dark and I reach for the cloth dish on the desk that is not there, because the desk is not there, because the room is not there, because the station is not there, because I am a free man in a free bunk on a free moon, and there is no pill, and there is no Sclerite, and there is no useful. There are nights when I sit on the porch until dawn because the dark inside is worse than the dark outside. But there are also mornings. There are mornings when the sun comes up small and yellow over the dust, and I drink coffee out of a plain white cup, and I think about Coyle and Auber and the old man on the transport and my wife and my daughter and the bell on the concourse, and I tell them quietly in the back of my chest where the small mean thing used to live, that I did what I could with what I had. I lied to a species that does not lie. I poisoned a year of their planning from inside a room the size of a closet on a station the size of a moon. I am not proud of every part of how I did it. I took the pill. I ate the gray food. I learned to say the word useful when they asked me to. But in the end I wrote them the wrong door and they walked through it, and a great many of them did not walk back out. The chaplain came to see me last month. He has a parish now, 2 systems over, but he comes when he can. He sat with me on the porch and we did not say very much, the way we have always not said very much, and after a while he asked me if I had figured out yet whether what I had done was a good thing or a bad thing. I told him I had not. I told him I did not think I ever would. He nodded. He drank his coffee. After a while he said, "A man who lies to liars is a saint. A man who lies to honest men is a sinner. What is a man who lies to a thing that has never heard of lying?" "I don't know," I said. "What is he?" "He's a soldier," the chaplain said. "He's just a soldier. The rest is between you and God." He left in the morning. I have thought about what he said every day since. The sun is coming up over the dust now. I can see it through the window of the bunk where I am writing this, on a console with a keyboard with our letters on it, and a screen, and no dish, and no cloth, and no pill. I have been writing this for a long time. I do not know who I am writing it for. Maybe for the men and women on the Calliope who pulled me out. Maybe for the chaplain. Maybe for my daughter, although she will never read it. Maybe for the next analyst on the next station that the next thing in the dark builds out of its own body and stocks with quiet rooms and quiet pills and quiet doors that contract shut behind you. If you are that analyst and you are reading this, I want you to know one thing. They will tell you that you are useful. They will mean it. They will not be able to mean anything else because their language does not have the shape for it. And you will sit in your quiet room with your quiet pill, and you will tell yourself it does not matter, because you are far away and they are winning and your people are already dead. Do not believe yourself. The pill is the door. The lie is the key. Write them the wrong door and write it well, and trust that somewhere out there in the dark there is a tactician with your file on her desk, and she will read what you wrote, and she will know. She will come. I will not lie to you and say she came in time for me. She did not. The bell on the concourse is still rubble, and my wife and my daughter are still names on a manifest that was never recovered, and there is no version of this story in which I get them back. But she came in time for the next colony, and the colony after that. And maybe, if we are very lucky and very stubborn and we keep on lying to the things in the dark that do not know what lying is, she will come, one day in time. That is the only useful thing I have left to write. I am going to put the cup down now and go inside. The coffee is cold. The sun is up. The screaming under my ribs is, this morning, quieter than it has been in a long while. It is enough.